Welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us because today's mission is, frankly, unlike any other we've done. We're going to unpack a massive historical puzzle from 1854 London.
Yeah, it's a completely fascinating case.
It really is. We're drawing on historical medical records, epidemiological accounts, and primary sources from the era to dissect how, basically, a single doctor armed with just a map, a pencil, and honestly sheer stubbornness revolutionized our entire understanding of disease.
He really laid the groundwork for the scientific method we still use today
Yeah.
to track outbreaks.
Exactly. But to get there, I want to set a scene for you. I want you to picture this. It is early September, 1854. You are standing in the pristine, affluent, leafy hills of Hampstead.
Right, which is crucial to remember.
Yes, because this is miles away from the dense, industrial, soot-stained slums of central London. The air up here is, it's fresh. It carries the scent of gardens and open fields.
It was widely considered some of the healthiest air in the entire city.
Exactly, the most restorative air you could find. And in this incredibly pristine environment, a widow living a very quiet, isolated life suddenly dies of cholera.
And the location of her death is really the crucial anomaly here.
Because on the exact same day, her niece, who lives over in Islington, which is another area entirely, separated from Hampstead by miles of city streets, she dies of the exact same disease.
Right.
And neither the widow nor the niece had been anywhere near the raging, catastrophic cholera outbreak that was currently tearing through the center of London. They hadn't set foot in those filthy streets.
No, not at all.
So by every single metric of the settled medical science of that era, they should have been perfectly, untouchably safe.
They absolutely should have been. And to understand the absolute bewilderment this caused, we really have to look at the reigning medical consensus of the 1850s.
Right.
At that time, cholera was universally believed to be contracted by breathing bad air in filthy, overcrowded environments.
The miasma theory.
Exactly, miasma. The scientific establishment, the government, the local doctors, literally all of them operated on the unquestioned assumption that the disease was an airborne poison. I mean, if you weren't standing in the invisible cloud of filth, you simply could not get sick.
Which turns this whole situation into a Victorian locked room mystery. Two impossible deaths.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Because think about it, if the killer is strictly in the air, but the victims are miles away and never breathed that specific air, how did the killer get into the room?
Right, it doesn't make any sense under their paradigm.
But one man heard about these two utterly impossible deaths, and rather than just writing them off as, statistical anomalies, he deduced that the entire medical establishment had the murder weapon wrong.
The killer wasn't a gas at all.
Right. It was something that could be boxed up, carried, and delivered.
And that realization is just a profound paradigm shift. But, to understand why this doctor's realization was so revolutionary, and honestly why it was so fiercely resisted, we first have to understand the absolute terror of the times.
We have to dive into the fog of that settled science.
We do. We need to dissect why it had such a tight psychological grip on the society of the era. Because the visceral threat of cholera is something we really struggle to comprehend today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we think of disease today as a gradual decline, right? You get a cough, maybe a fever, you spend a week in bed, and maybe things take a turn for the worse.
Cholera did not operate on that timeline. Not even close.
Yeah.
It was a fast-acting killer of the highest order. The timeline was violently abrupt. You could have a perfectly healthy person walking down the street in the morning with zero underlying conditions, and they could show their very first symptom at noon and be dead before the sun came up the next day.
Just dead in under 24 hours. Wow.
Yeah.
And the actual biological mechanism of it, it's just horrifying. The body essentially turns on itself.
It really does. The disease fundamentally alters the function of the human gut. The mechanism, which of course they had absolutely no idea about at the time, is driven by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. So once it enters the small intestine, it produces this specific toxin. And this toxin essentially hacks the cells lining your intestinal wall, forcing them to hold open their chloride channels.
Wait, so instead of your body absorbing water and nutrients like it's supposed to, the flow is completely reversed?
Massively reversed. The cells basically dump huge amounts of fluid and electrolytes directly into the intestinal tract.
Oh, man.
So the victim experiences this profound, uncontrollable purging. They lose water faster than they can possibly drink it, leading to a state of severe hypovolemic shock.
Which means the blood actually thickens, right?
Exactly. The blood thickens, the skin turns this terrifying bluish-gray color because the circulatory system is just collapsing. The victim is tragically and literally dehydrating to death while essentially drowning in their own purged fluids.
So you're fine at breakfast and you are a corpse by dinner. The psychological toll of living in a city with that kind of invisible sword hanging over the population, I mean, it must have been paralyzing. Every time you felt even a slight stomachache, you had to wonder if your 24-hour countdown had just started.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
And human beings, we cannot psychologically tolerate that level of random invisible threat without seeking an explanation.
We're pattern-seeking animals.
Exactly. The society desperately needed to know how the killer was moving so they could avoid it. And the explanation that provided them with a sense of control was the miasma theory.
Right, the bad air, the idea that disease is literally a foul vapor.
Yep. The theory basically postulated that this invisible vapor rose off the sewage, the rotting organic material, the really overcrowded slums of the city.
And London had a lot of that back then.
Tons of it.
Yeah.
And the belief was that atmospheric conditions, like temperature, humidity, and wind, could concentrate this miasma. So if you happen to walk through a dense pocket of it and inhaled, the poison entered your lungs and you contracted cholera.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure. If you're listening to this and putting yourself in the shoes of a Victorian citizen, and every single leading scientific mind, the entire Lancet Medical Journal, the government's own Board of Health, they are all absolutely certain the vector is the air. How does science get so permanently stuck on such a bad idea?
It's a great question.
It feels like trying to convince a modern society that the sky is actually neon green.
Well, the danger of consensus is that it's often built on overwhelming, albeit misinterpreted, sensory evidence.
Ah.
Miasma theory made complete intuitive sense to Victorian doctors because of the specific environment they were observing. You have to consider the sensory experience of 1854 London. The population had exploded, but there's basically zero modern sanitation infrastructure to support it.
Right. No proper sewers.
None. The Thames River was essentially a massive, slow-moving open sewer, and the slums were incredibly overcrowded with literal mountains of human waste accumulating in cellars and courtyards.
Oh, God. The smell must have been an absolute physical wall hitting you in the face. It was staggering. I mean, unbearable. And the doctors simply mapped the geographical data of the deaths onto the geographical data of the stench.
Okay, that tracks logically.
Right. Where did it smell the worst? In the poorest, most crowded, most unsanitary slums. And where were the highest concentrations of people dying of cholera?
In those exact same slums.
Exactly.
So they essentially blamed the smoke alarm for the fire. They saw two things happening at the exact same time, the terrible smells and the terrible death rates, and they just assumed one caused the other.
It's a classic fatal mistake of confusing correlation with causation. To the medical minds of the era, this wasn't just some working hypothesis. To them, it was obvious, settled truth.
Right.
They believed the foul air was the active agent of the disease rather than just a byproduct of the same unsanitary conditions that were actually spreading the real pathogen.
It's an incredibly dangerous trap, though, because the logic just reinforces itself. I mean, if I'm standing in a courtyard that smells like decaying matter and everyone around me is dropping dead, I'm absolutely going to blame the air, too.
Of course you would.
It's an overwhelming sensory input that basically demands to be identified as the threat. But they were looking at the completely wrong biological pathway.
Yeah, they were. And this systemic blindness sets the stage for a catastrophic failure of public health when a new, highly localized threat emerged.
Right.
So in late August of 1854, the general citywide fear of cholera suddenly condensed into a specific explosive nightmare in one singular neighborhood.
The Soho district, specifically the area centered around Broad Street. And this isn't just an uptick in cases, we should clarify. This is a full-blown eruption.
The sheer velocity of the Soho outbreak is staggering to comprehend, even by modern epidemiological standards.
Yeah, the numbers drop like an anvil. In a mere 10 days, roughly 500 people died in a geographical area you could literally walk across in a few minutes.
It's devastating.
Over 600 would be dead before it ended. We're talking about 10% of the immediate neighborhood's population being wiped out almost overnight. The historical accounts describe a complete and total breakdown of the social fabric. People were dying faster than carts could haul the bodies away. Anyone who had the means, the money, or just the physical strength to flee the area did so immediately.
They abandoned their homes, their businesses.
Yeah, leaving the streets to the dead and the dying. It was a ghost town.
And into this absolute chaos stepped Dr. John Snow. Now, the credibility of the man making the claim is paramount here.
We have to talk about who he was.
Exactly. Dr. Snow was not a fringe radical. He wasn't a homeopath or someone shouting conspiracy theories in the town square. He was a highly respected, deeply embedded physician. He was actually Queen Victoria's own anesthetist.
And that specific job title, Queen Victoria's anesthetist, it feels like the ultimate key to his mindset.
Oh, entirely.
You don't become the person trusted to render the monarch of the British Empire unconscious by being a sloppy thinker. You have to be meticulous, data-driven, and highly observant.
And look closely at what the actual practice of early anesthesia required. Snow was a pioneer in administering ether and chloroform.
Gases.
Yes, gases. His daily professional life involved observing exactly how airborne substances interacted with the human respiratory system. He understood the mathematics of diffusion, how a gas enters the lungs, crosses into the bloodstream, and affects the central nervous system.
Oh, wow, the physiological disconnect there is huge.
Right.
Because if cholera was caused by inhaling a miasma, the initial symptoms would have to be respiratory.
Exactly.
You would see coughing, lung damage, maybe neurological symptoms as the poison hit the brain. But cholera victims don't present with lung issues at all.
Their lungs are perfectly clear. The pathology of cholera is entirely localized, at least initially, in the gastrointestinal tract.
Right.
Snow looked at the medical presentation and realized the symptoms were consistent with something being swallowed, something irritating the stomach and intestines, not something being breathed into the lungs.
That makes perfect sense.
His profound expertise in airborne medical treatments made him the one person uniquely qualified to realize that cholera was fundamentally not acting like an airborne pathogen.
But despite having the perfect background to see this, he was treated as a pariah on this specific issue, because he had actually published a pamphlet back in 1849 arguing that cholera spread through contaminated water.
And the medical establishment largely ignored or just ridiculed that 1849 publication.
They just laughed it off.
Basically, yeah. The idea that a disease could be transmitted by invisible agents in a seemingly clear glass of water while the air outside smelled like a literal open grave, it just seemed absurd to his peers.
The psychological weight of holding that position is immense. It's not some polite academic debate happening in the quiet halls of a university. There is an active, terrifying outbreak happening right in front of him.
People are dying in the streets.
The death toll is climbing by the hour. He is convinced he knows the mechanical factor of the death, but all of his respected peers, the authorities, the medical journals, they are all telling him he is dangerously misguided. The mental fortitude required to hold your ground, to trust your own logic against the overwhelming consensus of your entire society, that is a rare human trait.
It really is. And when the Broad Street outbreak erupted, Snow understood that writing another theoretical paper wouldn't move the needle at all. The miasma paradigm was just too deeply entrenched.
He couldn't win with philosophy.
No, he needed irrefutable, hard data.
So he utilizes what might be the first true instance of rigorous field epidemiology. He doesn't stay in his office and theorize. He physically walks into the epicenter of the horror in Soho.
He goes directly into the hot zone.
He goes door to door, house by house, treating the entire neighborhood like a massive, tragic crime scene.
And the danger of that act alone is notable. While Snow didn't believe the air was lethal, everyone else absolutely did. He was walking to a zone that the rest of the city viewed as a toxic gas chamber.
Right, the bravery is incredible. So he's in there, and he interviews the survivors, the landlords, the grieving families, and he asks these hyper-specific questions. Who died in this room? On what day? And the crucial variable, where did they get their daily drinking water?
So he is compiling all these raw, grim statistics. But, numbers on a ledger rarely change deeply held human beliefs.
Right. A spreadsheet isn't going to convince the Board of Health.
Exactly. So Snow's next move is the stroke of genius that secures his place in history. He translates the abstract statistical data into a spatial visual format. He creates a map.
The famous ghost map.
Yes.
He takes a standard street map of the Soho neighborhood, and for every single fatality he has recorded, he places a small black mark, like a little bar, right at the specific address where the death occurred.
He essentially generates what modern spatial analysts might recognize as a primitive Voronoi diagram. He is plotting points of data to see if a spatial relationship actually emerges.
It's the ultimate method for finding a signal in an overwhelming amount of noise. And the noise here is a chaotic city of millions with 600 people dying in a sudden wave. But the signal is the visual pattern those black bars create.
And what a pattern it was.
As he plots the deaths, the marks begin to pile up. They cluster. getting thicker and thicker, literally blackening the map around one highly specific geographical locus.
The public water pump on Broad Street.
Yes.
The visual correlation is devastating. The map demonstrates this undeniable gravity. The closer a resident lived to the Broad Street pump, the higher the density of fatalities.
It's just a dark stain on the map.
Exactly. And as you move away from Broad Street toward other public pumps in the surrounding neighborhood, the death rate drops off a cliff.
But, and this is a big but, a map showing a cluster is still just a correlation.
Right. A miasma theorist could just look at the map and say, well, obviously the toxic cloud of bad air is centered right over Broad Street. That's why they are dying there.
Right, they could just say the miasma was thickest there.
Exactly. To truly break the raining theory, Snow has to rule out the surrounding environment. He has to hunt down the anomalies. And in complex investigations, the exceptions to the rule often provide the absolute most illuminating evidence. There were these glaring, impossible anomalies right in the middle of this dense death zone.
Right.
The most prominent was the Lion Brewery, which was located on Broad Street, practically adjacent to the suspect water pump.
Okay, so under the miasma theory, the workers inside that brewery are breathing the exact same localized foul air as the families dying in the tenements right next door. The brewery should have been a slaughterhouse.
It should have been. The brewery employed over 70 men, and the mortality rate among them was practically zero.
Zero. That's
It
insane.
was a massive anomaly. And when Snow investigated this, the behavioral data completely subverted the airborne theory.
Because the workers were given a daily allowance of malt liquor, they simply didn't drink the water from the Broad Street pump. They drank the beer they brewed on site.
And the mechanics of the brewing process are the hidden savior here. Long before the widespread acceptance of germ theory, the brewing process inadvertently functioned as a massive water purification system.
Oh, because they boil the water.
Exactly. The water used for the beer was boiled, which effectively sterilized it, killing the Vibrio cholerae bacteria.
Hmm?
And then the alcohol content further inhibited any bacterial growth.
Wow. So anomaly number one is a massive structural flaw in the bad air theory. The air inside the brewery is the exact same as the air outside, but the water consumption is different and the survival rate is 100%.
Yes. And then there's the second massive anomaly.
The local workhouse.
Right. The workhouse on Poland Street, which is a very short distance from the Broad Street pump. Now, Victorian workhouses were notorious for their grim, cramped conditions. They housed the destitute, the elderly, the vulnerable.
Right, packed tightly together in these poorly ventilated spaces.
Exactly. So if you were going to design a laboratory to test the lethality of a bad air disease, a Victorian workhouse is exactly what you would build. By all the settled science of the day, a cholera outbreak directly outside its walls should have swept through the building and killed almost everyone inside.
It should have been a tinderbox.
Yet, out of over 500 inmates, only 5 died of cholera during the entire Soho eruption.
5 out of 500. Wow.
It was a statistical fortress in the middle of a war zone, so Snow went into the workhouse to find the variable.
And the variable was infrastructure. The workhouse had its own private well on the premises.
Yep.
The inmates were completely isolated from the Broad Street public pump. The poorest, most vulnerable people in the neighborhood were saved by a complete fluke of municipal plumbing.
Snow's synthesis of this data is meticulous. He's actively hunting down the edge cases that break the miasma paradigm. Every single anomaly, the brewery, the workhouse, they share the same air as the victims, but utilize a completely different water source.
The map and the anomalies are a devastating piece of circumstantial evidence for the immediate neighborhood. But it entirely fails to explain our locked room mystery from the very beginning of the deep dive.
Yes. The widow in Hampstead.
Exactly. How does a contaminated well in Soho reach out and kill a woman sitting in the pristine fresh air of Hampstead miles and miles away? The local map doesn't cover her at all.
And the Hampstead widow serves as the ultimate stress test of Snow's hypothesis. I mean, if his theory holds universal truth, there must be a physical, mechanical connection between her isolated home and the specific pump on Broad Street, regardless of the physical distance separating them.
So he travels out to Hampstead to interview the widow's grieving son. He ignores all the standard questions about the air in the house or the smells in the garden. He asks the one targeted question his data demands: where did your mother get her drinking water?
And the son reveals a deeply tragic quirk of personal preference. The widow had actually previously lived on Broad Street years ago,
Wow.
and she had developed a fondness for the specific taste and effervescence of the water from that local pump.
People had strong preferences for different pumps back then.
They did. The water was clearer and colder from that specific well. So even after she relocated miles away to the clean air hills of Hampstead, she maintained that preference. She actually paid to have water from the Broad Street pump bottled, loaded onto a cart, and delivered across the city to her home.
That is just a chilling realization. She literally imported her own assassin.
She drank the imported Broad Street water in Hampstead, and she died of Broad Street cholera in Hampstead.
And the niece?
The second impossible death, the niece in Islington, is resolved by the exact same vector. The niece had been visiting her aunt in Hampstead just before the outbreak. She drank the delivered water alongside her aunt, returned to her own home in Islington, and died there.
The structural elegance of this proof is just stunning. For you listening, this is the smoking gun that shatters the miasma theory completely. A theory based entirely on geographic proximity to foul air cannot survive a victim who was never geographically proximate to the air.
Oh, it falls apart instantly.
The victims were isolated in clean air. But water is physical. It can be bottled, it can be transported on a cart. The death moved with the water.
It is a triumph of logical deduction and epidemiological tracking. It establishes the vector beyond a shadow of a rational doubt. However, the epistemology of science, how we actually prove what we know, requires us to acknowledge the really frustrating snag in Snow's victory.
Right, because having the behavioral and statistical proof isn't exactly the same thing as having the biological proof.
Exactly. Snow was a rigorous empiricist. He didn't just look at the map, he actually took physical samples of the water from the Broad Street pump. He analyzed it chemically. He put it under a microscope to try and find the physical agent of the disease.
He wanted to see the killer.
But the optical technology of 1854 simply did not possess the resolution required. The Vibrio cholerae bacterium is infinitesimally small.
So he looks through the lens, searching for the killer he absolutely knows is there, and he sees nothing but indistinct organic matter that could be found in basically any water source in London.
Just murky water.
Right. He has the map, the brewery, the workhouse, and the widow. The logic is an airtight vault. But he cannot point to a squirming gem on a glass slide and say, there is the monster.
And because of that, he's forced into a position where he has to win a high-stakes argument over public health entirely on sheer, careful, undeniable correlation and pattern recognition. He used the macro movement of the disease through a population to prove the micro nature of the pathogen.
Armed with a map, a pattern, and an airtight deduction, but completely lacking microscopic proof, he now has to convince a deeply entrenched, highly skeptical authority to take immediate physical action. Which brings us to the showdown.
Yes. September 7th, 1854. Dr. Snow brings his findings before the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish. These are the local authorities responsible for the neighborhood's infrastructure and the public health responses.
And these men are devout miasma theorists. They believe with every fiber of their being that the bad air is killing their constituents. And here comes this eccentric doctor with a map claiming that the very water pump they maintain is basically a weapon of mass destruction.
The psychological dynamics of this meeting are fascinating, really. Because Snow doesn't demand. They instantly rewrite their entire understanding of biology. He doesn't ask them to fund a massive overhaul of the London sewer system right then and there.
Right. He doesn't try to boil the ocean.
Exactly. He targets the intervention to the absolute minimum viable physical action required to stop the dying.
He simply asks them to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump.
It is an absurdly small, almost comical physical act compared to the monumental scale of the crisis. Just detach the iron handle. Without the lever, the vacuum mechanism fails, the water cannot be drawn, and the immediate vector is severed.
He bypasses the need for ideological agreement. He just needs them to break the machine.
And it works.
The board members remain deeply skeptical of his broader waterborne theory, obviously, but the data of the localized cluster is alarming enough that they agree to the physical intervention. The handle comes off, the pump is disabled, and the outbreak dies away.
Now, the removal of the pump handle has become one of the most mythologized moments in the history of medicine. But we really have to look at the messy, unvarnished reality of the timeline here. We cannot succumb to historical oversimplification.
Right, the heroic narrative is always, Snow takes the handle off, the dying stops the next day, the crowd cheers, and science marches forward.
The empirical reality is far more sobering. By the time the parish board finally agreed to disable the pump on September 7th, the epidemic in Soho was already rapidly receding.
Wait, really? Why the sudden drop-off? Did the bacteria just die out?
The drop-off was demographic, not biological. The sheer terror we discussed earlier had emptied the neighborhood. Over 600 people were dead, and thousands more had fled Soho in absolute, justified panic.
Right, there was no one left to infect.
Exactly. The density of potential human hosts had shrunk drastically. The outbreak had likely already peaked simply because it had run out of available victims in the immediate radius.
So removing the handle didn't act as a magic brake on a speeding train. The train was already basically running out of track.
Precisely.
Yeah.
However, the intervention was still utterly critical. What removing the handle accomplished was preventing a devastating second wave.
I see.
As the panic eventually subsided and residents began returning to their homes in Soho, if that pump had still been operational, the returning population would have consumed the contaminated water, and the catastrophic cycle would have instantly restarted. The missing handle permanently capped the event.
It's a really poignant realization. He intervened at the tail end of the tragedy, but he closed and locked the door so the killer couldn't strike twice. But, the aftermath of this victory is perhaps the most frustrating chapter of the entire saga.
Oh, absolutely.
The map, the widow, the board meeting, the cessation of the outbreak, none of it moved the needle of scientific consensus. The medical establishment dug their heels in and actively rejected his theory.
The institutional resistance was immense. Once the immediate terror of the outbreak faded, the parish board actually replaced the handle on the Broad Street pump.
You're kidding.
Nope. The Board of Health conducted their own investigation and concluded that Snow's water theory was incorrect, formally reaffirming that the Soho outbreak was caused by a localized atmospheric miasma.
Unbelievable.
The Lancet even published scathing critiques of his methodology.
He handed the most advanced scientific minds of his era the literal blueprint for saving thousands of lives, and they just waved him away because the truth didn't fit their pre-existing worldview. The paradigm of bad air was just too massive a ship to turn.
It was.
And John Snow died of a stroke 4 years later in 1858. He was only 45 years old. He died entirely unvindicated by the wider scientific community, never getting to see the world acknowledge that his map was actually right.
It is the brutal tragedy of the pioneer. To see the mechanics of the universe clearly decades before society has the tools to understand your vision.
But even though Snow's role in the story ends there, the mystery of the Broad Street pump itself wasn't fully closed. We know the water was the weapon, but water pumps don't spontaneously generate lethal bacterial pathogens. Something had to infect the well in the first place.
Right.
The final missing piece of the puzzle requires the introduction of a completely different kind of investigator.
Enter Reverend Henry Whitehead. He was a local curate at St. Luke's Church in the Soho area.
And Whitehead enters the story not as an ally, but as a fierce critic. When Snow's findings began circulating, Whitehead was deeply offended.
He was a staunch believer in the miasma theory.
Right. And he felt defensive of his community and its infrastructure. He believed Snow was unfairly maligning the local water source. Whitehead actually set out with the explicit stated goal of disproving the water theory once and for all.
But Whitehead possessed something incredibly valuable: deep, trusting relationships with the local population. Snow was an outsider, a physician asking clinical questions. Whitehead was their pastor.
He knew everyone.
He had stood by their deathbeds, he knew their family histories, and he had access to the intimate details of their daily lives. He used this access to launch his own rigorous investigation, literally retracing Snow's steps to find the flaw in the logic.
But Whitehead possesses an intellectual trait that is arguably rarer than scientific genius. He possesses profound intellectual honesty.
He really does.
He starts gathering his own data, conducting exhaustive interviews, mapping out timelines, and as he analyzes his own findings, he realizes, to his absolute shock, that his preconceived notions are completely wrong. The data he is gathering actively destroys the theory he set out to defend.
The willingness to allow reality to override your deeply held biases is the cornerstone of true investigation. Whitehead completely changes his mind. He realizes Snow was entirely correct, and he pivots from being a critic to becoming a vital collaborator.
That's amazing.
And it is Whitehead, utilizing his deep community ties, who manages to perform an incredible piece of historical detective work. He tracks the massive 600 fatality outbreak back to its absolute biological origin point.
He finds patient zero.
He does.
A child known in the historical record as Baby Lewis.
Through his exhaustive timeline reconstruction, Whitehead discovered that in late August, just days before the explosive eruption of the wider outbreak, an infant living at 40 Broad Street had contracted a severe case of cholera.
40 Broad Street, the address is chilling. That house is located immediately adjacent to the public pump.
Now we have to examine the grim mechanical reality of Victorian plumbing. When baby Louis fell ill with profound diarrhea, the child's mother did what any caretaker would do. She washed the heavily soiled diapers.
Right.
She soaked them in water and then emptied that heavily contaminated water into a cesspool located in the cellar area of the house.
A cesspool now teeming with billions of Vibrio cholerae bacteria.
Whitehead actually orchestrated a physical excavation of the site. Investigators dug down into the earth around the pump and the house. They discovered that the brickwork lining the cesspool at 40 Broad Street was severely decayed.
Oh, no.
And crucially, that decaying cesspool had been constructed barely 3 feet away from the vertical brick shaft of the well that fed the Broad Street public pump.
3 feet of dirt. That is the entire margin between containment and a massacre.
The mechanics of the groundwater contamination were undeniable. The heavily infected water from the leaking cesspool simply seeped through the 36 inches of porous earth, draining steadily and directly into the cold, clear drinking water supply that fed the entire neighborhood.
Wow.
The mechanic was incredibly mundane and devastatingly lethal. With that physical excavation, the mystery of the 1854 cholera outbreak was finally comprehensively solved.
From the soiled diapers of one sick infant, leaking through 3 feet of dirt into a well, drawn up through an iron pump, and eventually loaded onto a cart bound for the hills of Hampstead. A perfect, unbroken chain of biological cause and effect.
Really is.
It is a brilliant, dark story of Victorian London, but we cannot leave this in the 1850s. The sweeping legacy of this single investigation fundamentally altered the trajectory of the modern world.
The ultimate vindication of John Snow's logic arrived far too late for him, but it truly redefined medicine. It was not until 1883, which is nearly 30 years after the Broad Street outbreak, that the pioneering German scientist Robert Koch finally isolated and identified the Vibrio cholerae bacterium under an advanced microscope.
Koch finally brought the invisible monster into focus. He proved the existence of the germ that Snow could only deduce.
Koch provided the definitive biological proof that validated every single logical leap Snow had made through the fog of scientific ignorance decades earlier. Microbiology finally proved what epidemiology had mapped.
The scale of Snow's legacy cannot be overstated. He didn't just solve a localized crime, he practically invented the modern science of epidemiology, the tracking of how disease moves through a population across time and space.
He established the fundamental protocols of spatial analysis and public health.
Every single time humanity faces a massive health crisis today, we reach for the tools he forged. When scientists map modern cholera outbreaks in disaster zones, when they trace the transmission chains of the Ebola virus, when we all watch those digital maps lighting up with red dots during the COVID-19 pandemic, every time we rely on data visualization to track a killer we cannot see with our naked eyes, we're standing on the shoulders of John Snow.
Absolutely.
He handed us the mathematical blueprint for societal survival.
It is an inheritance that has saved countless millions of lives. And there is a physical, enduring echo of this history standing today in London. If you travel to Soho, to the site where it all happened, the street is now called Broadwick Street, you will find a memorial.
It's a very striking memorial, too.
It is a dark, Victorian-style water pump erected right near the original location. And, as a deliberate testament to the history, the pump is built with no handle.
A silent monument to the terrifying power of a single point of failure and the immense power of a single individual committed to the truth. We've walked through the suffocating fog of the miasma theory, we've traced the black lines on the map, and we've seen how the removal of a simple piece of iron changed the course of medical history. John Snow proved that sometimes the most catastrophic threats to our survival aren't hiding in the shadows. They are hiding right behind the settled science and unquestioned assumptions of our time.
Very well said.
He had to fight the entire world to prove the air was innocent and the water was a weapon. So as you navigate the incredibly complex, overlapping crises we face today, I want to leave you with a question to mull over. What are the invisible pump handles in our own modern world that we are failing to remove, simply because we are too stubbornly attached to our own comforting bad air theories?